Welcome to one of the more interesting chapters when it comes to budget and finance. This is where a little bit of entrepreneurial activity takes place. We're talking about auxiliary enterprises and we're talking about capital budgeting. These are very, very interesting topics, as I said, very creative topics, but they do require a lot of careful planning. Part of the reason we spent last Monday night focusing on the tools of planning as they relate to budget is this is where you're going to use the majority of them. And the more efficiently you use them, the less grief you're going to have to deal with when you get in either one of these things. So, first of all, please spend a little extra time. The slides, I don't normally like the sets of slides to be that long, but to get everything covered, we kind of had to do that. So please look at them carefully. I also sent you an email today. I'm making this on Thursday because one of the more important readings that was up there, it comes from Higher Education Today. They don't get quite as interesting in terms of letting us have copies or letting stuff stay as an addendum to something like a distance course or Blackboard. I do know that I will be able to have help. I made a phone call to campus. I will be able to have help to get you a hard copy by the time we meet on Monday, so that's a good thing. The guidelines that we've explored for the general operating budget are pretty much the same for auxiliary and for capital budgeting. So it doesn't hurt if you kind of reflect back on where we've been. One of the best ways to think of auxiliary, and the text does do auxiliary first, is simply it is a service that is provided to a specific set of people. A target group is what the text says. There are not a lot of narrow groups like that on most campuses at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Classic examples tend to be bookstores. Now, bookstores are there to provide books for those that want to purchase them directly from the school, as opposed to purchasing them on Barnes & Noble or Amazon or something like that. The same way, the largest auxiliary enterprise at most universities and four-year colleges is the issue of housing, of residence life, which will include a place to sleep, it will include food, and it oftentimes also includes certain social activities, There's some analytical tools for how you look at this auxiliary budget found on page 120. I'd suggest you look carefully at it, particularly table 5.1 and 5.2. What's interesting, if you look at some of the jargon they use, they're talking about emergent trends. That should make you feel comfortable. We spent a good bit of time last Monday talking about environmental scanning. Now, how is this handled? How are auxiliary enterprises handled? There are a couple different ways. One is a direct payment. When you go to the university, you make a housing payment. That housing payment then enters the budget sheet, the account sheet, under that particular auxiliary enterprise. On the other hand, there could be a fee structure in which you might actually sign a housing contract and pay on a monthly basis. It all depends upon how your school has set this up. There are a number of questions and issues that come up for these auxiliary enterprises that each university chooses to answer in a different way. One, for example, is virtually all of these have to be self-sustaining. They don't take any of the operating budget of the university. So they're given, they being the people that run them, are given a budget target to hit. Now, if there are, for example, emergencies, those can be dealt with. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the future as we go on with this thing. Very often, the operating budget will, however, extend a line of credit to the auxiliary enterprise, which then will be paid back as the various elements of the money comes in, the bookstore, the food service, residence facilities, etc. Those things are important. One of the things that the text talks a lot about, and I distinctly get the impression that the two authors have spent a good bit of their time working for private institutions, specifically allowing the auxiliary enterprises to build a reserve fund. That doesn't happen too often in the public sector. Well, we find ourselves, if there is extra money, that money is either allocated to a specific function. For example, and this happens at a number of bookstores. If the university or the college or the community college is running the bookstore, they set a profit margin that they seek to make. At the community college I retired from, they bought the books at whatever wholesale rate they could get based on the number consumed. Then they added 20%. Of that 20%, 5% went to the college's scholarship fund. 15% was reserved, and that was enough, at least through the last, maybe 18 months ago was the last time I was directly involved with any of this. That 15% was enough to cover the overhead of the facility. Universities usually have extra money going into the university or the college's rainy day fund. If there is an emergency, like when Irene hit, not Irene, when the one that hit New Orleans, Katrina, the state's rainy day fund was virtually done away with as the universities, four-year colleges, and community colleges that serve the southern end of Louisiana. It was impossible for them to have enough of a reserve to be able to deal with them, so the state's rainy day fund had to be used. That was very, very important. Payback to those funds is a relative thing, since the federal government stepped in and helped out. The state was able to recoup some funds that way, to the extent that the universities and colleges and community colleges in southern Louisiana have been able to come back into full function. They may very well be paying back through a reduced income from the state. And what would normally, they would be made an allocation based, for the community college at least, on enrollment. It might be reduced based on how much money they have in their line items, and then that money would be transferred back to the state's rainy day fund. That's another thing that can possibly happen. Okay, the next thing, of course, that we have to deal with is the capital budget. That in and of itself is very important, and it's a cyclical kind of thing. Please take a look at page 127. It's environmental scanning again, just as we talked about it. We use what if, we use benchmarking, then we do a design, feasibility study, create a plan. The plan is then reviewed, and building takes place. One of the things the text mentions, which is very important, and that is you don't just start in building. You have to prepare the territory that you are going to use to be able to build on it. That is another cost, not spoken to directly in many budget documents, but needs to be. It's a long-range process. I listened to something last week. You can get it on the internet. Disney is building another Disney World in Europe. I forget the country. It doesn't matter. They've already started their planning. They don't even plan to break ground until 2016. It's a long-time project. One other thing I should comment about, be careful when you think about gifts. Gifts tend to have teeth in them, as our textbook said. Somebody may want to give you money. Classic example, Joe Paterno. Many of you know who Joe is, the football coach like forever at Penn State. He and his wife have regularly pumped money into the Penn State undergraduate library. Fine, except the university is continually having to match those dollars because one guy, however wealthy he may be, can't handle the whole project. One of the other interesting things that happens are joint ventures. Many smaller schools will joint venture dormitories, let somebody else build them and own them. They will operate them. They'll use financial aid to pay for them, but whatever profit goes back to the people that built them, and they will also pay the overhead cost. Let's talk about building. Let's talk about the capital budget and building for just a second. That's what we have left. Hidden costs. Change orders are the bane of the existence of anyone involved with buildings. If you don't get it right the first time, it's going to cost you a lot more to fix it. Overruns on time due to weather, those are called acts of God. You can't blame the construction company. However, if weather isn't an issue, if you're lucky, you've written the right kind of contract that penalizes them for not living up to the timeline on the contract. Trust me, we'll have a lot more dialogue about this come Monday. Have a good weekend.